Can you hear me
Good
all right?
afternoon, Ma'am.
Yes, thank you, Mum.
Lovely. Well, nice to see you both. Welcome back, everyone who's listening in. Final day of the appeal at Wyreston Road, Ashbourne, Derbyshire. And today we're here just to look at the obligation, the section 106, and also to hear closings. So shall we start with the obligation, unless there was anything you needed to bring to my attention before we get started?
Nothing from me, Ma'am.
No, for me, thank you.
Okay, all right. Okay, so I've got a draft section 106 with the travel plan attached to it. Is that the latest version?
Ma'am, if I can just invite my colleague Louise Burnett, who will be dealing with the 106 issues, to jump in on this one.
Hi, good afternoon. It is almost the latest version. There's been a slightly amended version circulated yesterday, which just picked up a couple of typos and an amendment to the affordable housing definition, as there was some discrepancy between the plan that was appended and the numbers in the definition.
Okay. And on the appellant side, Ms. Hunter, are you happy with those? Or were you, well, are you both happy with those changes? And are we looking to get it signed imminently?
Can I say I'm in the same position as Miss Ogley. I've not been involved. I've in fact, only minutes before I was asking to get a copy of the latest version as well, which is why I was interested in your question. So if I could hand over to Mr. Dugmore, who I think is the one who's been dealing with it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, no problem. Yeah, that is all agreed, and we've agreed the latest change as well. So very minimal undrawn agreement, so no problem on our end there.
Lovely. Okay. And how long do you think it will take to sort of execute it and so on?
We've been looking at timeframes, and we've got the county sealing, or their next sealing date is next Thursday. So we would be looking to get it to the district council for week commencing the 10th. I understand that they can seal any day bar Friday. So we would look to have it completed by the end of the week commencing the 10th of June.
Right. Okay. So I would probably get it on the 17th of June. That'd be fair.
If not before.
If not before, okay. So if we say the 17th of June, if not before, and I'll look out for that.
That's very helpful, Ma'am. Thank you. Hopefully it's not too long after the final replies are due, Ma'am, on the costs. So I don't think it drags our timetable out too far.
No, that's true. No, that should be in good time. That's fine. That fits with my reporting time. Quite neatly, so that's good. Okay. Can we just quickly run through what the Section 106 does and the various obligations and so on? Just for anyone who's listening, and just so I can be clear. I mean, I had a look at it, and I've got the SIL compliance statement with me as well. So if there's anyone on the council side, I've just got a couple of questions as we go through about some of the contributions. So is there anyone that can help with that?
Mum, I think it may be that's Mr. Robson's turning his camera on, so I think it may be Mr. Robson then.
Okay,
thank you.
Lovely. All right. So Ms. Burnett, are you probably best placed just to talk through what the obligation, what the Section 106 does, and then we'll look at the obligations individually?
Yes, certainly. So the Section 106 secures a number of obligations, and then taking them in order, there is provision of affordable housing, which comprises a mix of rented units and first homes. And also some shared equity units. Those are all identified on the plan, which is to be appended to the final agreement.
Okay.
There is then an off-site affordable housing contribution, which is payable to the district council. An allotments contribution. Sorry, do you want me to go through the figures as well?
No, that's fine. So there's an affordable housing contribution, I think we just said, and
Yep,
then
yep. Yeah, so there's the offsite affordable housing contribution, an allotments contribution, healthcare contribution, and a parks and gardens contribution, all of which are payable to the district council. There are 2 monitoring fees, one payable to the district council and one to the county council. And then we have a library contribution and a travel plan monitoring sum and travel plan bond, all payable to the county council. And then there is a schedule relating to the provision of biodiversity net gain, which links in with one of the conditions on the draft planning permission, which just provides for the various possibilities of satisfying the condition, whether that is on site, off site, or via a BNG financial contribution.
okay, thank you. Okay, so the agreement is between the district council, the county council, and Woodall Homes. So there's various obligations going between the county council and the local authority. Okay. I'll just run through this FUL compliance statement then. So if I start with the travel plan bond of 58,725, then it says the travel plan bond would secure sufficient funds towards annual bus tickets for a 5-year period. So presumably that's bus tickets for people on the new residents and so on.
That's correct, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay. And that is what the bond is for, just the bus tickets, essentially, to cover the cost of the bus tickets.
Well, the definition of the bond actually refers to implementation of revised targets. It links in with the travel plan condition, which secures compliance with the approved travel plan. And it was my understanding that that contribution was used solely for implementing revised targets. The definition in section 106 doesn't refer to bus tickets.
Okay. Following a failure to meet the targets. Okay, so it's a bond in case the travel plan doesn't meet its targets to ensure it does. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Mom, can I just raise one point at this stage, because this was something that interested me, and I've had it just to confirm, if Miss Burnett could confirm. The moment you said you have a copy of a travel plan appended, which is Appendix 4, I think. It is the framework travel plan which we had in the core documents, as I understand it, 1st of August 2003. So the targets, as I understand it, are not actual targets; they're potential targets. So they're to be fixed later on, as I understand it.
Okay. What's the phraseology there, Mr. Hunter, for the travel plan? What did you call it?
I think it's page, it's a framework travel plan at the 1st of August. That's its title. I think it's core document 128 or something like that. And it's the objectives and targets are on pages 19 and 20. And I think, as we touched on in the evidence, it says we can't develop them fully until we've done surveys after the development has been granted permission, and there's been, I think, is it 50% occupation? And so they're just penciled in as potential targets at the moment. There's nothing fixed at the moment. It's just what I wanted to make sure I've understood correctly. So it describes, I think it uses the word potential. Yes, the table 7.1 is examples of potential targets.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just trying to work this in my head. So we've got a sum of 58,000 to be used for purposes of implementing revised targets following a failure to meet the targets in the travel plan, but the travel plan isn't really got the targets in. So does that work?
I think that's it. I suppose I'd say that's for Miss Burnett to explain to you. That's what they're proposing and what has been agreed with the county, it seems.
Paragraph 9 of the travel plan just summarises an action plan, and there's an ongoing monitoring process. So there will be, I imagine, an ongoing obligation to sort of review those targets as the development is carried out.
Okay. Do you know
Yeah.
how the travel plan bond was calculated? Because say the SIL compliance statement says the fee is calculated based on a travel trip rate. So the SIL compliance statement, there seems to be two things at work here. So the section 106 is saying the travel plan bond is there in case the travel plan doesn't meet its targets, but the SIL compliance statement is very much saying this money is to secure bus tickets. So do we know which one is right, or are both right, or what's going on here?
For my part, Mum, I don't see how the bond can secure the passes. I think the travel plan itself is what requires the passes to be paid for by the developer, by the appellant in due course. They will have to be provided and funded by the developer. I think the way that the framework travel plan works is that there are indicative targets, and those indicative targets need to be we did touch on this during the inquiry last week, Ma'am, where I said what happens is effectively it takes a staged approach, as I understand it. So obviously we know what we're aiming for. It's 12% modal shift. The slight difficulty, of course, is that until we've got some occupation, we don't know how much work there is to do. So it may be that has to go upwards. What you wouldn't want to do is have that go downwards. And if there are other mechanisms, other measures that are needed to deliver on that indicative target, my understanding is that's what the travel bond is for, to ensure that those additional measures can and will be brought forward. So there's a bond there that's effectively held by the Highway Authority that can be drawn down on if required. That's the way it's intended to work, as I understand it.
Okay.
I can't explain why the SIL statement says that it's for the use of bus tickets, I'm afraid. That's not a question
I'm
I
just
can
wondering if
assist
that's
with.
the way that they've come to a figure, is if we can't get a modal shift, we'll provide bus tickets and this is how much it would cost. But I don't know.
No, I don't think that can be right, Ma'am.
Okay.
But I've not been involved in the negotiations, so I can't say what's in the county's mind on that, and why it's gone, why that's been included. I don't know whether or not Mr. Robson can shed any further light on it. But the bus tickets are an integral part of the travel plan in any event, so it doesn't it can't make sense for the bond to be there to secure those tickets.
Well, are the bus tickets in the travel plan? Because I didn't think they were, because it is just this framework plan.
My understanding is, I was looking at this for closings yesterday, is that it's not. Well, actually, I can't remember off the top of my head. Is the honest answer to the question, without going back and pulling out the document, Ma'am.
No. Yeah, I think the travel plan is a bit of a broad brush at this stage, the one that we've got. But it's not really a well-worked travel plan specifically for this site just yet, is the feeling I'm getting. So I think although there's been talk about these bus tickets as an aspiration, I'm not certain it's actually in this travel plan. Does anybody know?
Might be able to help a little bit, Mom.
Yeah.
And that's that the travel plan at the minute. I think the only reference to tickets, excuse me, is public transport taster tickets, which is organised for the first round of residents occupying the dwellings.
Yeah.
And then to sort of go further to your comment there of, you know, this is the travel plan is not sort of like the final document, if you like. At the start of section 6 of the travel plan, it talks about once the targets and measures have been further developed in line with the proposed implementation strategy, these will be agreed with Derbyshire County Council in writing by the appointed transport plan coordinator. So there is sort of further work to do, if you like, in terms of you know, really nailing down the specifics of it.
Yeah. Okay, so how do I get over this issue of how the travel plan bond's been calculated? Because I understand that the purpose, where did the figure come from?
It's my understanding, ma'am, that was the figure that was generated from the county council. I have actually subsequently asked for that just to be broken down. It's not ideal, but I can get that to you just in terms of where that amount is actually broken down and come from. I can share it with all parties involved in this, but unfortunately, I don't have that information directly to my fingertips at this moment.
Yeah, okay, that would be helpful if we can get that. Does anyone have any objection to that email being passed on? No, okay, so that's to follow, and it's from the Highway Authority, is it?
That's correct, ma'am. Yes, the county council.
Okay, so shall I ignore the stuff about bus tickets then in the seal compliance statement, Mr. Robson? Yeah.
Sorry, ma'am, I'm just trying to make a note of that. Yes, please, yes, if you could do
okay. So that will follow on then with justification for that. Okay, so that's the travel plan bond. The travel plan monitoring contribution, so that is paying for someone to monitor it and implement it. Is that correct in a very basic language?
Yep. Yes, that's correct, ma'am. Yeah.
Okay. Right, so affordable housing contribution off-site, yeah, fine. So that's set out in the policy, HC4, is that correct? How that's calculated?
That's correct, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, lovely. Right, so the healthcare contribution, there's been a request for a contribution towards GP services, and the 2 GP practices were concerned with our Ashbourne medical practice and Ashbourne surgery. Do we know specifically what those works might be, and again how the 78,480 was calculated?
Again, ma'am, the information came directly from the health group, as a health body, was it, where I have asked for how that is broken down and what it's going to go specifically to. A very basic conversation with them. It was to deal with improvements to the actual, so not to employ anybody per se, but just to improve the actual facilities at those surgeries, such as an extension and or refitting of a treatment room, I believe one was mentioned, but they didn't give me the actual specifics. But again, apologies, I can certainly forward that to the group just so you can see whether those monies are going to be funneled towards.
Yeah, so is that an email again?
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Again, if I could have that forwarded just so I can see what evidence we've got on that, that would be helpful. Anyone got any objections if I take receipt of that? No, okay. Okay, Parks and Gardens contribution, £12,710.70. This is a contribution towards public open space and sports facilities. And then it says the provision of allotments is required. So specifically, this is towards allotments, is it? Yep. Okay. Because then I noticed there's an allotment contribution of 5,314 that comes next. So is that a typo on the SIL compliance statement? Or is it just one of them?
It was a typo, ma'am.
Okay, so is there no parks and garden contribution, or is that something separate?
That's not right, is it? There's separate contributions, aren't there, Louise?
They are, yep, there's an allotment contribution of £5,314.70, and then a parks and gardens contributions, which is towards provision of parks and gardens in Ashbourne District.
Right, okay, so on the SIL compliance statement where it says parks and gardens is for allotments, I should scrap that.
Sorry, ma'am, I've just looked it up now. That's correct. My apologies. I've just turned to the document now.
Okay, so this is a contribution of open space. Do we know where and how? And have we had regard to the fact that there's a lot of open space being provided as part of the development? What I'm really trying to get at is what's the need? Where's it going, the money, and how's it been calculated?
I mean, Sean, in respect to the parks and gardens contribution, is it not the case that within your SPD you have your different kinds of open space typologies, and generally speaking, for developments of this size, you wouldn't have parks and garden provision on site. They're more sort of formal sort of open space setting, needing a greater quantum of space. So there's a contribution, so that you're sort of, you know, you're contributing the proportionate amount to that. Is that basically it?
That was my reading of it. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, if I can help, I mean, it's dealt with in core document 4.1, committee report, paragraph 7.59 to 7.61, which essentially says, I think, what Mr. Bassett was just outlining there, that there are deficiencies that have been identified, and the SPD sets out the contribution that's required on appropriate identified sites in Ashbourne, on appropriate sites in Ashbourne, which are identified in consultation with the neighbourhood manager.
Right. That's my worst nightmare, Mr. Hunter. When I ask a question about a SIL compliance statement and someone says, "Oh, it's buried here, Mum." In this
I know.
document.
I'm sorry, Mum. I'm sorry. I know.
What's the point of a SIL compliance statement? So is it in the SPD? Should I have a look at the SPD? Because these are questions I'm going to have to sort out later when you're all gone on your holidays. So, do we know what? Do we have the Derbyshire Dale Developer Contribution SPD as a core document? Do we know?
I don't believe so, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
It's helpful. If we don't, I think I'm going to need that to have a look at.
Yeah, I don't think it is there, Mum.
Okay. I've lost you now. Hang on. Right, there you are. Okay, right. So can you assure me that the SPD definitely tells me where the deficiencies in Ashbourne are by the time I get it and look at it later? And it has a calculation in there, does it?
I'm sorry, Mum. I'm just struggling to turn to that document now. There's a unfortunately IT glitch. I can certainly follow that up, Mum, and make sure that's in there.
Okay, all right.
I'll check this in there.
Okay. So if that can be sent on. So the Parks and Gardens contribution is basically, you're telling me, to some public open space in Ashbourne where there's a deficiency. Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Come on, get a bit enthusiastic. It's £12,000. Okay.
Sorry, Mum. It's again, it's a little bit out of the wheelhouse that I'm in. But I do very much hope that it's in there.
Louise, does it define where this money needs to be spent?
In the SPD.
I mean, in the section 106, I was thinking.
Oh right, okay.
In the section 106, it says towards the provisions of parks and gardens in the district of Ashbourne.
Right. Okay. I just really need to know a bit more than that. So hopefully the SPD will tell me where those deficiencies are, and how it's been calculated. Okay, the allotment contribution then. So this is for allotments. Do we have a shortage of allotments in Ashbourne? Does anyone know?
Ma'am, I could just say that I'm just looking at it for the first time. I can see that the deficiency referred to in the committee report is referred to in the SPD. I can't take you any on a sort of exegesis of where that is, but I can see that it is referred to there.
So the committee report says there is a shortage in Ashbourne.
Yes, I think it says, or in the district in any event.
Oh right, and that is by virtue of this SPD again.
Yes, which is based on an open space paper itself.
Okay.
So maybe there's a few documents that need to be traipsed through for it.
Okay, so the SPD is hopefully going to show me that there's a shortage of allotments in Ashbourne and how we've calculated £5,314.70.
Yes.
Okay, library stock contribution £6,131.06. Increasing the stock in Ashbourne Library. Okay, and I think we've got a bit of detail about this. Well, we've definitely got a recommended stock level and the average price of stock items. So that's presumably how it's being calculated, is additional stock required as a result of the development.
Yeah, I think on allotments, Ma'am, when you get the copy of the SPD, it's page 3 of 8. I'm just trying to look at it on my phone because I can't get it up on my computer and be on Teams with you at the same time. And it's basically worked out as a square meterage per dwelling, 3.94 square meters for allotments, 9.74 for parks and gardens. That's required for any new residential development of 11 or more dwellings. And then the contribution, I think the calculation carries on below. Calculation of open space provision again is set out there for allotments.
Okay.
And the cost per square meterage is given as well on page, I don't know why it's telling me 3 of 8 at the top, but it's actually page 20 and 21 and 19, I believe, of the SPD.
Okay.
So it looks quite precise, Ma'am. Is the general position on that from what I can see, having never looked at it before today.
Are you being paid by the council to defend their contribution?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't. You know, they can chip in if they like, Ma'am.
You're very keen to hand this money over.
And just a further point, Ma'am, and it's sort of it's consistent with what Miss Ogley was just saying. Is it in core document 3.13, which is a consultation response from the policy officer at Derbyshire Dales, it also sets out some of those figures in there as well for you. I think it's page.
Okay.
With me, I've lost the page number now. Page 5, I think it is. Yeah, page 5.
Yeah, I'll just have a quick look at that one then. 3.13. Yeah, okay, that seems to combine it all, but the SPD I think would be useful as well, just to get it from the horse's mouth. Okay, thank you for that. So I was just on library stock and I just said it looks like it's calculated by working out the additional stock required for the development and then doing that at £20 average per stock item. Does that sound correct? Have I got that correct? Anyone? Mr. Robson, does that sound correct for library?
Sorry, ma'am. Yes, it is. Sorry, I was just trying to reread the response from the County Council, but that, from my quick read of it, that's about right. Yeah.
Okay, so is there a response for specifically on libraries that I should perhaps see? Or is that in the policy one that we were just
yeah, there is, ma'am. I think that's core document 3.12.
It was a specific response, wasn't it, Mark? I mean,
yeah, 3.12 and section 4 on page 6 of the PDF, ma'am, and it just lists those figures you just quoted there.
Section 4, did you say?
Yeah, section 4 on page 6 of the PDF counter. It's quite a detailed explanation of how it's calculated, actually.
Yeah, that's useful. Thank you. This is why we have a SIL compliance statement. Okay. Right, useful. Sorry, I've completely lost you all again. Can you still hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
You are all there. I can't see you. In opening my core documents, I appear to have lost you on the screen that you're on. Oh, here we are. Got you. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, right. Biodiversity net gain. I think this is simpler. So this is just to ensure that the biodiversity net gain that's the appellants put forward will be secured. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Is that specified in here?
It is, Mum. If I try and explain it, Louise, just jump in if I've missed something. But you'll recall when we had the condition section, there's a condition, I think it's condition 6, that specifies that we're going to deliver 14.33%, I think it is, net gain. The section 106 is termed as a minimum of 10%. That's not to sort of, I don't think there's anything inconsistent there, because you have to sort of, to comply with the condition, we're going to have to hit the 14.33, but it was put in as it was drafted as a minimum of 10%. As I say, I don't think the two are inconsistent, but I just wanted to draw that to your attention, really.
Do you think you need both? Or would the condition suffice if it's more specific?
Louise, does the 10% achieve anything over and above what the condition does? Is it needed, do you think?
I'm just having a look at the definition again.
Which condition is it again? Sorry, Mr. Bassett.
Condition 6.
I mean, the definition of biodiversity net gain in the agreement could be changed, and we could link it more closely to the condition and just say as to reach a level as as required by the relevant condition.
Oh, here it is. Condition 6, yeah?
Yeah.
To achieve no less than a 14.33% net gain. Yeah?
Yeah.
Have you all gone mute? Sorry, perhaps you were talking to me. Someone say something?
No, that's
Can you
correct.
hear
That's
me?
correct, Mum. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's correct, madam. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Were you saying something a minute ago and I just couldn't hear you?
No, Mum, I don't think anybody was.
Okay, all right. Right, so
I think the answer to the sorry, Mum.
no, carry on.
I think the
you
answer
know
to the
where I'm
question.
going.
Yeah, I think the answer to the question is that it doesn't necessarily secure any additional BNG, but what it does is secure the 30-year management period. And I think, generally speaking, we tend not to use conditions if we're going beyond 5 years for any biodiversity or LEMP or habitat enhancement and management, etc. So I think that's what the 106 adds. The wording could be changed to make that clearer. But I think that's the reason why it's in birth rather than just being left to the condition itself.
Yeah, okay. So the section 106 goes further than the condition.
Yes.
So could the section 106 say 14.33?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then actually I could possibly take that out because it's under the LBEMP, isn't it?
Yes.
I might be able to tweak the condition because there'd be no reason to say it twice if the legal agreement is doing more of the job, basically, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, happy with that, Mum.
Right. Okay. I'll have a look at that then.
I think with that as well, Mum, it might be worth. I think at the moment the 106 is drafted to provide an alternative potentially of offsite. That's not needed. I think that's clear from the evidence. And that seems to be agreed between the parties. So again, it could be slightly amended to just make that clearer. If nobody's got any objections to it, we could just take out the reference to offsite altogether. We know that it's going to be 14.33% on-site, and then the management secured for 30 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So could that be tweaked before it's signed?
Yep. That's fine.
Because it is all on site, isn't it?
It is.
Okay. And then the landscape and biodiversity enhancement plan. So that's the same thing actually as the condition, isn't it? In fact, are they both? Let's just have a look. The approved LBMP will be implemented. Is one asking for the LBEMP, and then is the condition asking for it, and then the legal agreement is ensuring it's. Is that what's going on here?
Louise, can you clarify whether does the section 106 actually ask for any detail, or is it reliant on the condition?
No, it's reliant on the
Yeah,
condition.
so.
The requirement is to implement the approved LBMP.
Okay. Okay, so that just going back to the condition. So the condition 6 at the bottom says that the LBEMP shall include details of the legal and funding mechanisms by which the long-term implementation of the plan will be secured. That did sound like a legal agreement thing to me. So I could possibly take that out because the legal agreement is doing precisely that, isn't it? Or is it?
Well, it provides an obligation on the landowner to manage and maintain the landscaped area, but the condition does go slightly further in that it requires the funding details to be submitted along with the body or organisation, excuse me, who's going to be responsible for the BNG land.
So I could take out of the condition the legal mechanism, because the legal mechanism is section 106, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
but keeping the funding.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Anything else you want to draw to my attention on the obligation then?
No.
No.
No,
No.
thank
All
you.
right. I'll just wait for the SPD then, and any and those emails that we mentioned then, just to justify those obligations that we talked about, and then I'll have them to hand as and when I need them. Right. Okay. Shall we move on to closings then? Does anybody want? I think I've received them both by email. So council to go first, which I need to print off actually. So shall we just take 5 minutes just to get ready and have a quick comfort break, and then we'll do the council's closing? Does that make sense? And then followed obviously by Ms. Ogley.
Yes, ma'am. If it's, I mean, I'm quite happy to have my closing release now to the council. It would be helpful if I could print a copy off as well of Mr. Hunter's closing, so that I don't have to scribble like a maniac.
Yeah.
My hand's
We'll
turning
swap
into the
them.
claw. Yeah, so if we could maybe have 5-10 minutes just to make sure the emails get through the ether, then that'd be great.
Okay.
Shall I drop
let's-
mine into the chat? Oh, maybe not actually.
Maybe not. Yeah.
I,
just
I
do
think
that.
I think I have yours. So if
Oh,
I send
no
mine
worries,
and you
thank
can
you.
reply with
You
yours.
probably
Thank you,
can put it in the
Doctor.
chat,
Yeah.
but I won't
Yeah.
get it from the chat. That's the
No,
only
no,
thing.
that's
Yeah.
fine. Don't worry.
Okay, let's come back at 10:02 then.
Thank
And
you.
we'll have our paper copies.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome back. Right, Mr. Hunter, when you're ready then, would you like to make your closing?
Thank you, Mum. Can I just check whether Miss Ogley, oh, I see Miss Ogley did receive it. Sorry, I've just
Fine.
had a message, which you may have heard the ping of. Thank you very much. Okay, Mum, then I'll proceed. In summary, the local planning authority's overall position remains as it was at the start of the inquiry, namely permission should be refused on the grounds that the proposals conflict with the development plan and the framework, each looked at as a whole, and there are no other material considerations that would justify a decision to the contrary. However, the specific grounds on which it makes that submission have partly changed, insofar as it now only relies on part of reason for refusal 1 and no longer relies on reasons for refusal 3 or 7 at all. So, turning first into the specific topic areas, highway safety. The first part of reason.
Sorry, Mr. Hunter. Just to
Yes.
clarify on that, when you said no longer relies on 3 or 7, is it also the case that if we go back to the original decision
Yes.
making, 4 and 6 have also fallen away?
They have, but yes, they fell away before the opening. So yes, that's right. But I was just referring to the ones that were relied on in opening and are no longer relied on.
Sure.
now.
Yeah. Thank you.
But that's correct. Mum, I then set out the first part of reason for refusal 1, which I won't repeat. But I say that going to say this: these concerns have been validated by the road safety audits independently commissioned by the council and the appellant, which I'll refer to as the AMI RSA and the MRS RSA, and give all of the references again, which I won't repeat in square brackets. Crucially, both identify a problem arising from the fact that Wyston Road in this location has severely restricted visibility for vehicles heading north and is within an area of national speed limit, meaning that at least some drivers will not be expecting a significant residential access junction and may be travelling at inappropriate speeds, giving rise to the risk of collisions with vehicles entering or exiting the site. Both therefore recommend that the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit should be relocated to incorporate the junction, together with physical measures to complement it. It's not the case, therefore, as Mr. Price claimed in his proof of evidence, that no notable highway safety risks or concerns associated with the creation of a new access in this location were identified by MRS, or that, quote, there is agreement with the LPA that there are no material considerations to suggest the proposals would be considered as unsafe. Mr. Price also contended that there's a key difference between the RSAs in that AMIs assumes that the visibility displays required by manual for streets cannot be achieved. However, that is also incorrect. On the contrary, the advice in both RSAs is given on the premise that the technical information in the appellant's transport assessment, including that relating to visibility displays, is accurate. And again, I set out there in a bit more detail the relevant quotes from the two RSAs. So moving on to paragraph 7. In response to questions from you, Mum, Mr. Price said that he accepted the problem identified in the MRS RSA, but suggested that it could be overcome at detailed design stage with gateway features such as dragon's teeth. Nevertheless, in cross-examination, he accepted that if it was necessary to move the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit further south and for the road to be widened and or the footway extended, as Mr. Carey considers it would be, then he couldn't say that it could be done without altering the layout or removing some of the Category A group of trees to the south of the site access, which the appellant's arboricultural assessment identifies as being retained. Likewise, Mr. Bassett accepted that the Grampian condition which is proposed to allow a scheme for gateway features to be submitted and agreed couldn't be, or approved, that should perhaps read, couldn't be extended to include the sort of improvements that Mr. Carey believes would be required. Accordingly, permission could only be granted subject to such a condition if it were known that all that would be required to address the problem are the sort of gateway features referred to by Mr. Price. However, that is not an assumption that can be properly be made. Firstly, it's inconsistent with both RSAs. In particular, the appellant's own RSA did not, that should read, merely recommend signage to warn of the upcoming site access, but rather signage, quote, in addition to the relocation of the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit to incorporate the site access. Secondly, as Mr. Carey pointed out, widening of the carriageway, extension of the footway, lighting and signage were all required when the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit area was extended to incorporate the Red Road development to the north, and there's no reason why it should not also be required here. Thirdly, although the Highway Authority didn't ultimately object to these proposals, it didn't have the benefit of the RSAs or indeed any RSA at the time. Although Mr. Bryce said it has been provided with the MRS RSA, it has not responded to it. There is therefore no proper basis for presuming that when it does, it will agree with Mr. Price rather than Mr. Carey. This isn't a matter, therefore, that can simply be left to detailed design, as Mr. Price suggested. Policies S4 and HC19 of the local plan provide that the council will seek to ensure that developments have, quote, safe access and can be safely accessed. Likewise, paragraph 114 of the NPPF requires that when assessing specific applications for developments, it is ensured that, amongst other things, safe and suitable access to the site can be achieved for all users. And paragraph 115 provides that development should only be refused on highways grounds if, amongst other things again, there would be an unacceptable impact on highway safety. Mr. Price didn't contend that the safety problem identified by both RSAs at the junction was acceptable, and Mr. Bassett fairly accepted that the issue was fundamental, meaning that unless you can be satisfied that it will be capable of being resolved in the way suggested by Mr. Price, the appeal should be dismissed on this ground alone. So then, turning to traffic impact, I set out then the second part of the reason for refusal. Sorry, Mom, that should read, I've mixed those up, 1, I think, rather than 2. Apologies. And then go on, paragraph 13. The local plan itself identifies congestion in Ashbourne Town Centre as a significant problem, and the existing signalised junction of Station Street, Compton Street, Sturton Street, Derby Road and Old Hill as a particular source of peak hour congestion, where, quote, mitigation measures and the promotion of sustainable transport interventions will be required. Mr. Carey agreed with the council, that is, that the omission of that junction from the appellant's traffic impact assessment meant that it wasn't possible to conclude that there would be a severe impact on the operation of the network. However, following receipt of Mr. Price's rebuttal, he accepted that on the basis of the additional modelling work set out there, the impact was only likely to be moderately adverse rather than severe. The planning authority therefore withdrew this part of the reason for refusal, but nevertheless submits that it is a material adverse impact to be taken into account in the overall planning balance. Whilst the appellant and Mr. Price were not prepared to accept that the modelling reveals any adverse impact at all, that position isn't tenable. The results clearly show there would be a material effect given that the mean max queue lengths on the A515 Derby Road Old Hill arm in the AM peak would increase by 2.1 vehicles from 24.9 to 27 in comparison to the 2032 no development scenario. You can from can just be deleted, and an increase in 5.3 vehicles from 21.7 to 27 in comparison to the 2024 baseline, and would bring it very close to 90% saturation in a location where this would be likely to lead to increased overhanging of junctions due to the distance between it and the Park Road junction. Thus, it's clear that development will, both individually and cumulatively with other committed development, appreciably worsen traffic conditions in this sensitive location. It's also relevant to note that it was for such reasons that the Red Road development to the north was required to contribute to mitigation measures, whilst no such measures are proposed as part of this scheme. Turning next to accessibility, and again I set out the relevant parts of the reason for refusal, this time reason for refusal 2. And then from paragraph 19 onwards I read, policy HC19 provides that the council will ensure that development can be accessed in a sustainable manner by, amongst other things, delivering sustainable patterns of development, ensuring that additional growth is managed and where possible accompanied by accessibility and travel demand measures to minimise single occupancy car usage, requiring that new development can be integrated with an existing or proposed transport infrastructure to further ensure choice of transportation method and enhance potential accessibility benefits, and promoting the maintenance and introduction of appropriate facilities to support cyclists and pedestrians. Policy TRA1 provides more succinctly that development proposals should, proportionately to the scale and nature of the scheme, ensure 1, convenient links to public transport services to help reduce car dependency, 2, priority for pedestrians and cyclists in the design allowed to development, including for people of all levels of mobility. The proposed scheme manifestly fails to comply with both policies and would fail to offer the genuine choice of transport modes, which NBPF paragraph 109 says should be provided, in particular, public transport. The site isn't well located for or served by buses. The nearest stop would be approximately 500 metres from the centre of the site and around 750 metres from the western end of the site. Services at that stop are infrequent, only hourly, and therefore the majority of the dwellings on the site would be situated in excess of the 300-metre maximum walking distance recommended by the CHIT. The site's gradients would also act as a further barrier to bus use, and for most of those living at the site, therefore, public transport wouldn't be a genuine or realistic alternative to the private car. Walking. Whilst the nearest primary school is located within reasonable walking distance of the site, no other facilities or amenities are. As Mr. Price's table 5.7 shows, they're all between 1.16 kilometres away from the site access and 1.5 to 2.1 kilometres from the westernmost property. As such, they're all well outside the acceptable walking distances recommended by the IHD, and in fact, many fall outside even the IHD's preferred maximum distances. Similarly, it's clear that the site would not constitute a walkable neighbourhood as defined in the CIHT guidance and manual for Streets 1. Furthermore, as Mr. Carey explained, and the appellant's witnesses didn't seriously dispute, the gradients on the site mean it's only the fittest people living there, particularly at the western end, who could be generally expected to walk such distances. Therefore, in practice, and not just based on standards in guidance, walking is unlikely to be a genuine or realistic option for many or most of those living at the site. Cycling. Although the distances for the facilities and amenities may not be inherently excessive for the purposes of cycling, again, the site's gradients are likely to make this an unattractive option for all the fittest residents. Connectivity and permeability. The site simply has no internal or external connectivity. There is no footpath link of the sort provided on the Red Rose scheme to the north, and certainly nothing like the swathe of internal and external connections provided on the David Wilson Home site to the east. Whilst the lack of external connectivity may not be the appellant's fault, it is the appellant who has chosen to promote a scheme on this scale, which, on its own case, inevitably requires properties to be sited along a long span road / cul-de-sac, where residents, particularly at the far end, will have a long walk or cycle on a route with off-putting gradients in order to access facilities and amenities. The impact of this is illustrated by comparing what the position would have been if it had been possible to secure the link that was originally proposed via Premier Drive with the distances via the site access, which are in many cases nearly double what they had been if it had been possible to provide that link and thereby facilitate access to the various amenities and facilities in or close to Waterside Park, including a cafe, convenience retail, and the nearest medical facilities, which are not incidentally confined to a hospital. As a result, the site's layout is not properly connected with the adjacent streets networks, resulting in an enclave which encourages movement to and from it by car rather than by other modes, contrary to the guidance in Manual for Streets 1. Indeed, it's noted that even Mr. Bassett, the appellant's planning witness, was compelled to accept for this reason the failure to provide the link constitutes harm. Travel plan. The travel plan, whatever modal share objectives and other measures it ultimately contains, will not be able to overcome the inherent limitations of the site in terms of distances and ease of access on foot or cycle. The western link via Premier Avenue. In view of the appellant's application to amend this proposed link, the specific concerns raised by reason for refusal 7 fall away. However, the planning authority's concerns regarding the implications of not providing the link in terms of accessibility, particularly from the western end of the site, remain, as I've set out in the preceding section. Flood risk and drainage. As explained by Mr. Bowl, the concerns raised in reason for refusal 3 regarding insufficiency of information provided with the application have now been addressed through the additional information in Mr. Keller's proof of evidence and rebuttal. The Council therefore no longer objects to the proposals on flood risk or drainage grounds, subject to conditions, of course. Design and layout. Reason refusal 5 sets out those concerns. Again, I won't read those out. And then I turn to national planning policy on design. I say that is clear that, firstly, development that isn't well designed should be refused, especially where it fails to reflect local design policies and government guidance on design. Secondly, in order to be well designed, it must, quote, function well and add to the overall quality of the area, be visually attractive as a result of good architecture, layout and appropriate and effective landscaping, be sympathetic to local character and history, including the surrounding built environment and landscape setting, establish or maintain a strong sense of place, using the arrangement of streets, spaces, building types and materials to create attractive, welcoming and distinctive places to live. And finally, create places that are safe, inclusive and accessible. Thirdly, new streets should be tree lined unless there are clear, justifiable and compelling reasons why this would be inappropriate. The National Design Guide and the Model Design Code, which NPPF paragraph 134 indicates, should be used to determine decisions on applications in the absence of locally produced design guides or codes build on these themes. In particular, the former sets out 10 characteristics which well-designed places have, including characteristics relating to context, identity and movement, on which both documents then provide more detailed guidance. It's common ground that local policy in the form of PD1 of the local plan and DES 1 of the neighbourhood plan are consistent with national policy and guidance. As Mr. Lally states, PD1 establishes a requirement to create context-specific designs that are rooted in appreciation of the specific character and identity and context of the Derbyshire Dales townscapes and the landscape setting within which it's placed, and calls for, quote, a layout and design approach that integrates in a positive way with its adjacencies and contributes positively towards local distinctiveness and sense of place. Furthermore, the requirement in PD1 that development on the edge of settlements enhances or restores landscape character reflects the particular importance of such sites in urban design terms. Policy DES 1 contains similarly consistent requirements, albeit with an even greater emphasis on the need for locally distinctive and locally inspired design that responds to the existing character and history of the town, rather than anywhere type estates, given Ashbourne's, quote, strong visual character. The layout of the appeal proposals and their design more generally fails to satisfy the objectives of national and local planning policy, as well as clearly departing from specific guidance in the National Design Guide and Model Design Code. In particular, the layout is essentially based around a long cul-de-sac, which directly conflicts with the guidance in the, and I'll use the acronyms now, NMDC, that they should be only used as tertiary streets, i.e. for access to small groups or clusters of homes. Moreover, although it may be said that the appellant had little option but to base the layout around a cul-de-sac due to the site's challenging topography, it doesn't follow that it was required to create such a long cul-de-sac in contravention of national guidance. Rather, that is the consequence of the quantum of development proposed. As noted above, there is no choice of routes either internally or externally. Thus, the development will provide the opposite of a well-connected street network. The built development proposed has a poor relationship to its townscape and landscape setting, both internally and externally. Internally, as Mr. Lally explained, many of the areas of informal open space, which Mr. Carr accepted were intended to serve a recreational as well as a visual or ecological function, appear as, quote, spaces left over after planning, with homes turning their back on them and failing to ensure they're appropriately overlooked, something which is particularly evident in the case of those on the southern side of the Spine Road due to the reuse of retaining walls in gardens, see the DAS and site sections. Likewise, externally, buildings on the site primarily turn their back on the adjacent landscape and town, unlike the majority of the Red Road development above the site and the David Wilson Homes development to the east. Looked at from across the valley to the south, the site will not appear well integrated with the existing settlement edge, but rather as a separate, semi-isolated block on or close to the valley floor. The design of the development also fails to draw proper inspiration from its context. As Mr. Carr accepted, that's to be done by reference to what is positive rather than negative. Therefore, it's no excuse that examples of similarly poor design may be found in certain aspects of adjacent schemes. The scheme's extensive use of close-boarded timber fencing is an example of this, whilst its predominant use of only marginally modified standard house types is, that should just read indicative, delete an, of a more general failure to adopt an appropriately high-quality contextual approach and to create a specific identity / sense of place. The layout of the affordable housing proposed also doesn't accord with the principles of tenure neutrality. In particular, the units in the quad blocks at the western end of the site will plainly be significantly disadvantaged in comparison with the market housing in terms of accessibility and environmental conditions, being the furthest away from the site entrance, having no private amenity space and only very poor sunlight. The development is therefore not one which meets the aspirations of government or local planning policy and guidance, and hence cannot be described as well designed. So turn next to housing land supply. The remaining difference between the parties on this topic are set out in the addendum provided by Mr. Hayes after the housing land supply roundtable session. In short, whilst there's complete agreement over the requirement, that is 217 dwellings per annum, 1,085 over 5 years, no buffer applied, the appellant contends that the supply is 3.07 years, whilst the council contends it's 4.01 years. The main components of this difference are sites with 10 or more units, and which amount to a difference of 181 dwellings, so nearly the whole difference of almost a year. All of the sites that the council has maintained in the supply have in that part of the supply have detailed planning permission. Therefore, they fall within category A in terms of the definition of deliverable set out in the NPPF glossary, and accordingly are to be presumed so in the absence of, quote, clear evidence that homes will not be delivered within 5 years, for example, because they're no longer viable, there's no longer a demand for the type of units, or sites have long-term phasing plans. The first of these sites is Ryber Castle, Matlock, which is the difference between the parties being 46 units on the council's account and 0 on the appellant's. As Mr. Hayes explained, development has taken longer than is normal on this site due to the way that the developer is funding works and, of course, the impact of the pandemic. However, it's apparent from the modified scheme for 20 dwellings that was recently the subject of a resolution to approve that the developer wishes to make progress, with a fresh permission due to be issued within the next few months once the Section 106 agreement, which is currently with the council, is finalised. By contrast, the appellant simply asserts that the history of the use of the site justifies an inference that there is insuperable delivery or viability issues. However, that does not follow, and it doesn't amount to clear evidence that units will not be delivered within 5 years. There is therefore no reason to discount this site from the supply. The next disputed site, and the largest in terms of units in the supply, is Quarry Lane, Matlock, the opposing positions being 75 units versus 0 units. Mr. Hayes explained that though the site didn't have reserve matters approval at the base date, it now does. And the applicant is actively discharging conditions and moving quickly to be in a position to start on site. Furthermore, it's clear from the press release on its website that it's confident that the scheme will be built out in the near future. Despite this, the appellant maintains the site should still be classed as category B because it was in that category at the base date. That argument, however, is clearly without merit. As Mr. Denning accepted in response to a question from UMAR, there is no policy that requires such an approach, and in fact it runs directly counter to the approach which Mr. Roberts agreed to be the correct one in his proof of evidence by reference to the PPG and the Wilford Sands appeal decision. And I quote from that, "There's nothing in the NPPF or PPG that stipulates that all of the documentary evidence for a 5-year housing land supply has to be available at the base date itself. Instead, the PPG advocates the use of the latest available evidence." The same message was recently given in another appeal decision, Merleys Field, Stockport, which is cited in Mr. Hayes' rebuttal. This also explains why there's nothing objectionable about taking post-base date evidence into account, so long as it doesn't introduce new sites not included in the supply at the base date. I quote from that, "The appellant refers to 3 appeal decisions which it considers set out principles in terms of the evidence as to whether a site is deliverable. The retrospective justification of a site by reliance on evidence post-dating the housing land statement or the agreed base date, in brackets the Woolpit decision, is acceptable so long as the site is one which was originally included in the supply. Furthermore, there can be no objection to utilising the most up-to-date evidence of delivery. Provided that is the case, there is no risk of resetting the base date to the date of the inquiry discussion." The next site is Marston Lane, the difference there being 14 units on the council's case and 0 on the appellant's. Again, this is a category A site with full planning permission, and as Mr. Hayes explained, is being advertised on the developer's website. Again, the appellant has produced no clear evidence to show that homes won't be delivered on the site within 5 years, and therefore there is no reason to discount this site from the supply. The final disputed site is land north of Tansley House Gardens, difference being 47 units versus 0. As Mr. Hayes explained, this now has reserved matters approval, conditions have been discharged, dwellings are under construction and are being actively marketed by the developer. Therefore, the only argument advanced by the appellant is the fallacious one relating to sites switching to category 8 after the base date. Accordingly, there is no reason to discount this site from the supply either. The other remaining differences are very minor, i.e. there's a difference of 10 units in respect of windfalls and 14 units in respect of local plan allocations, which collectively amount to just over 0.1 years supply. Therefore, it's unclear how the dispute on these points could have any material bearing on the determination of the appeal. Nevertheless, insofar as it may be considered necessary to resolve it, the Council maintains the position set out by Mr. Hayes. Finally, in relation to this topic, whilst it's accepted that there is a significant shortfall in the 5-year supply, whichever figure is preferred, and that this has to be weighed in the balance, it's important that it should not be given undue weight. In particular, weight should not be given to it on the basis that there is, quote, a chronic and acute problem with delivering sufficient housing to meet local needs, because as the figures presented in Mr. Roberts' evidence show, actual delivery in the 5-year period to the 2022-23 AMR year was nearly 10 years supply judged against the local housing need figure for the district, which is the basis on which the adequacy of its supply is now required to be assessed. And I put in brackets, to be fair, Ma'am, that is not how Mr. Bassett expressed it. Rather, his point was that if Mr. Roberts' supply figure is correct, and if that figure is measured against the local housing plan requirement of 284, then the supply will be 2.06 years. However, what I'd say to that is not only is the supply figure disputed, but that's clearly not the calculation that's required now, given that we are agreed that it is the local housing need figure and the standard method that has to be applied in accordance with MPPF paragraph 77. So turning then to compliance with the development plan, Mr. Bassett agreed that if the council's case on highway safety or design is accepted, it follows that the appeal proposals would conflict with policies S4 and HC1 of the local plan, which he described as the key policies of the development plan, as well as policies PD1, HC19 and or DES1 and TRA1. And that in those circumstances, the only conclusion which could be drawn is that the appeal scheme is contrary to the development plan as a whole. For her part, Ms. Ford accepted that the converse is true. Turning next to compliance with national policy. While Mr. Bassett originally argued that in those circumstances, where there is conflict with the development plan, either because you've concluded in favour of the council on highway safety or design, or both, the appeal could still be allowed on the basis of, despite that conflict, the tilted balance might still be tipped in favour of granting planning permission. However, it's difficult to see how the application of the tilted balance could result in a different outcome in this appeal, given Mr. Bassett's acceptance that policies S4 and HC1 of the local plan, quote, specifically have regard for the scenario where the council is unable to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply and apply tests that are consistent with the MPPF, with the consequence that he agreed that they should be given full weight. Furthermore, as I've noted earlier, he specifically accepted that if the council's highway safety concerns were upheld, that would necessitate refusal. Although he was reluctant to agree the same in respect of the council's design concerns, I'd respectfully submit the same must follow given the clear wording of MPPF paragraph 139, should be refused, which clearly reflects the particular importance which the government attaches to good design in the context of delivering sustainable development, which again, as was noted with Mr. Bassett, specifically requires all 3 overarching objectives to be pursued in mutually supportive ways. Other material considerations. Finally, Mr. Bassett agreed that if the appeal proposals are contrary to the development plan overall, and also the MPPF looked at in the round, there are no other material considerations which would justify granting permission contrary to the development plan. And so in conclusion, for all these reasons, the council respectfully submits that the appeal should be dismissed and permission refused. Those are my submissions, unless I can help you with anything else.
Thank you, Mr. Hunter. Ms. Audley, are you happy to go straight into your closing?
Yeah, absolutely, ma'am. Happy to do so. Ma'am, hopefully, I think you've got my hard copy, so there won't be too much note taking for anybody. First of all, in the introduction, I just set off doing the same thing as Mr. Hunter did at the outset, was just to record the changes in the reasons for refusal as we've gone through the inquiry evidence itself. I've also, ma'am, at paragraph 5, just set out the main issues that you provided at the outset of the inquiry, and I followed that order. So I'm taking a slightly different order to Mr. Hunter. I don't think there's anything much in that. But firstly, I deal with housing land supply. Secondly, highways, including whether the proposed development will be safe, and then secondly, whether it will be accessible. So I deal with those together. Then I come on to design, and then I come on to the planning policy and balance. So turning swiftly to the main issues, ma'am, there is of course no dispute between the parties that the council is unable to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply. Unfortunately, despite attempts to do so, it wasn't possible for the parties to agree a range. And at the close of the round table, the appellant's position is that the council can demonstrate 3.07 years, with the council at 4.01. On either measure, however, Mrs. Ford made the council's position clear that significant weight should be afforded to the proposed development given the absence of a 5-year supply of housing. And that was the same whether or not the council's position or the appellant's position was preferred by you, ma'am. Mr. Bassett was in full agreement with Mrs. Ford on that point. And I just paused there to just pick up the point made by Mr. Hunter at paragraph 40 of his closings about 5-year supply shortfall not being given undue weight. I'm not sure that I entirely understand. Both experts accepted that it should be given significant weight, and that's what the appellant invites you to give to the 5-year supply, ma'am. The differences between the parties all relate to the question of whether certain sites should be considered deliverable. There's no dispute on the correct approach to calculating the requirement. The differences relate to the following categories: firstly, windfall, then commitments, and then allocations. At the close of the evidence, however, the differences on windfall and allocations is de minimis, and you've heard the parties' positions, ma'am, on that during the round table, and they don't need to be addressed further in closing. However, the largest area of dispute between the parties relates to commitments, and IQ 14 sets out those numerical differences at the close of the roundtable session. In respect of the reasons for the differences, which aren't found in IQ 14, I've just summarised these for you below with respect to small sites. So table 4 of IQ 15 sets out some of the detail here for you, ma'am. We're talking about a total of 19 sites. In effect, the appellant's position is that where planning permission for small sites was granted many years ago, and I give you the footnote 3 setting out some of the dates there. So all of them are at least 5 years old in terms of the grant. None of them have delivered. Some are over 10 years old, and the development has not been completed. The appellant's position is that the contribution to the 5-year supply should be discounted. As Mr. Denning explained, there's a high degree of uncertainty as to whether these sites will have come forward, and certainly no realistic prospect that they will deliver within 5 years. Where these sites have failed to deliver for protracted periods of time, this is clear evidence that they will not deliver within the 5-year period, ma'am. Large sites, 10 or more units. So again, the sites themselves are set out at table 5, 6 and 7 of IQ 15. Just give you the reference there for your deliberations, ma'am. First of all, Ryber Castle, which we heard quite a bit about from Mr. Hayes. Firstly, the appellant, ma'am, accepts that this site was granted planning permission for 46 dwellings in 2006. That was comprised of the conversion of the castle itself, 26 units, and residential units in the grounds, 20 units. Notwithstanding that, ma'am, the site has not delivered any completed dwellings since construction commenced. In the roundtable session, Mr. Hayes asserted that the conversion of the castle had progressed to a stage where dwellings would be completed within a year. However, there is no evidence that this is indeed the case, and an extract from the 2012-2013 AMR was appended to IQ 15 by the council. This simply notes that 26 dwellings were under construction, and of course that could cover a whole host of things. The extract appended to IQ 15 taken from 2019-2018, and give you the CD reference there, is somewhat confusing. Firstly, it suggests the total quantum is 47, not 46. Secondly, it says 38 units are under construction with 9 not started. This sits uneasily with the fact that 5 years later on, no units have been delivered. And secondly, the 20 units to be delivered in the castle grounds have been replanned. Mr. Hayes' proof of evidence sets out that a revised application was submitted in July 2022. Although the council resolved to grant permission in October last year, that's not been granted and the Section 106 remains outstanding. In the roundtable session, Mr. Hayes made clear that developer only progresses the scheme in stages when there is sufficient cash flow available to the developer to do so. It could not be clearer that the site is complex and has plainly led to the need to replan parts of the development, with planning permission not yet granted for 20 units in terms of the replan. That is clear evidence, ma'am, that viability is a key obstacle for this scheme. Despite being under construction since 2012-13, the conversion units have still not delivered any completions. The 20 units in the castle grounds plainly do not have a viable planning permission, and accordingly the appellant maintains its position that this site will not contribute to the 5-year supply. Then we move on, ma'am, to Class B sites, and I'll just give you the definition there in a footnote. I'm sure you're more than familiar with it, at the Bay State. So firstly, Quarry Lane, and secondly, Tansley House Gardens. Ma'am, it's agreed that the Bay State for assessing the 5-year housing land supply is the 1st of April 2022 to the 31st of March 2023. That was confirmed by Mr. Hayes. Oh, sorry, that's reflected in the actual AMR itself, ma'am. And Mr. Hayes confirmed during the roundtable that the next AMR for 23-24 was some way off from being published. At the Bay State, Quarry Lane was a Class B site and should not have been included in the 5-year supply. There was no published evidence to support its deliverability within the 5-year supply at the Bay State. The appellant's position on this is set out in paragraph 6.4.1 to 6.4.4 of Mr. Roberts' proof of evidence. And of course, we haven't heard from Mr. Roberts directly, ma'am, but I would invite you to just go to those parts of his evidence and review that for yourself in deliberations. The council relies upon detailed planning permission granted on the 18th of January 2024. That clearly occurred after the relevant Bay State and should not therefore be taken into account. Ma'am, Mr. Roberts addresses Tansley House Gardens at paragraph 6.6.1 to 6.6.3 of his proof of evidence. He accepts that planning permission was granted for this site in July 2023, but again, it occurred after the Bay State for the assessment and should not therefore be taken into account. Just a couple of points on my learned friend's submissions, ma'am, on this issue of 5-year supply and the Bay State. Well, just one quick point. Paragraph 36 on page 14, just to be aware, there may have been an appeal decision referred to in Mr. Hayes' rebuttal, but it's not in the core documents and it's not before you. So just to draw that to your attention. In conclusion, ma'am, on 5-year housing land supply, the appellant maintains its position and the council is only able to demonstrate 3.07 years of housing land. However, even if the council's case is preferred at just over 4 years supply, both parties agree that this does not affect the significant weight to be afforded in favour of the appeal to the shortfall in housing land supply on the facts of this case. Moving on then, ma'am, to highways. I'm sorry that my voice seems to be increasingly giving up the ghost here. Husband tested positive for COVID yesterday, so will bear with me if I start to struggle. So Dealing first then, ma'am, with access of the proposed development and safety. At the time planning permission was refused by the council, it's clear that the key statutory consultee, the Highways Authority, had no objection to the proposed development on any highways related grounds, including any issues related to the safety of the access. Mr. Carey accepted in cross-examination that the absence of any objection to the proposed development from the Highways Authority was highly material, and notwithstanding this, that he failed to have regard to that in his proof of evidence. It became clear during the examination of Mr. Carey that he was simply not aware of the dialogue that had taken place between Mr. Price on behalf of the appellant and the Highways Authority during the application process. And ma'am, in my submission, this is not a case where the Highway Authority failed to engage in the determination process at the application stage. Indeed, as can be seen from the relevant responses, in January 2023, the Highway Authority considered the proposed development did not align with the transport policies of the development plan and/or the NPPF, and I give you the footnote for the reference to the core documents. These issues were, however, fully resolved to the satisfaction of the Highways Authority, who concluded in September 2023 that, having reviewed the revised details, the Highways Authority can confirm that the external impact in terms of vehicle movements and accessibility has now been addressed, and it is considered that there will not be a severe impact on capacity or an unacceptable impact on safety. And of course, ma'am, that just reflects the language of the framework. That remains the position of the Highways Authority before this inquiry and before you, ma'am. It is clear that the Highways Authority view in January 2023 changed because of the proactive engagement between Mr. Price and the Highways Authority. In short, additional technical information was provided by Mr. Price, and that resulted in a position of no objection to the proposed development. This additional information included the third version of the transport assessment, dated August 2023, and I give you the reference there, ma'am, and Mr. Price's detailed response to the Highway Authority, and again, I give you the core document reference there. There can be no doubt in my submission that the Highways Authority took its responsibilities seriously and carried out a careful and thorough appraisal of the proposed development, considering all aspects of potential highways impacts, including any potential safety issues relating to the operation of the site access. It did not require the appellant to undertake a Stage 1 road safety audit prior to the planning permission being granted. Mr. Carey conceded that there is indeed no requirement that this be undertaken at this stage. Mr. Carey's alleged safety concerns regarding the access for the proposed development were entirely founded on a Stage 1 RSA undertaken by AMI, and I call that the AMI RSA just for ease of reference. Those who produced the AMI RSA were not called to give evidence to the inquiry and could not therefore be subjected to cross-examination. It is fair to describe the AMI RSA in large part as a partisan assessment, which appears to pay limited, if any, attention to the actual technical details submitted in support of the proposed development. In terms, the AMI RSA asserts that the vertical alignment of the carriageway severely restricts visibility from the site access to the right, and that language is expressly used in problems 2, 3, and 4 in the AMI RSA. The language used is categoric regarding the cause of the asserted visibility restriction. The vertical alignment of the carriageway is expressly cited as the culprit, not vegetation, the vertical alignment of the carriageway. It is difficult, if not impossible, to understand the basis upon which the AMI RSA reached this conclusion. The first paragraph on page 8 of the AMI RSA references a visibility drawing provided for the audit. There is no drawing reference provided either in the text in page 8 or in the Appendix A of AMI RSA. It appears highly likely that the AMI RSA has quite simply considered the wrong plan. Had the AMI RSA properly considered the relevant drawings and information in the TA, it's difficult, if not impossible, to understand how they could have reached any reasonable conclusion other than that the vertical alignment of the carriageway does not restrict the required visibility to the right of the site access. This is directly addressed by the second drawing in Appendix D of the TA, and I give you the reference, ma'am, which illustrates the vertical access for the visibility space. the vertical vis display plan, and which was included in the TA to demonstrate the very same point to the Highway Authority in August 2023. And I give you the reference there, Mom, just so that that round that point off. The Highway Authority specifically asked for this to be demonstrated in the vertical plane. That's what was done by Mr. Price in August 2023. It's explained in the letter that I've already drawn your attention to, and that's why the Highway Authority was satisfied, because they could see from those drawings that actually there is no issue with the vertical alignment of the carriageway restricting visibility. The assertions regarding visibility restrictions in the AMI RSA are demonstrably incorrect. Any conclusions drawn from these erroneous assumptions are similarly infected by the mistake and should not be relied upon. Indeed, the failure to properly consider key information available regarding vis displays as part of the TA calls the accuracy of the AMI RSA into question. This is reinforced in my submission by the inappropriate reliance in the AMI RSA on the on-site information it obtained only from a perspective gained as a passenger in a car. Photographs in the AMI RSA used for the objective of demonstrating alleged visibility restrictions clearly show they've been taken from inside a vehicle as part of the bonnet is seen in the photographs. As Mr. Price cogently and carefully explained in evidence in chief, this is not an appropriate way to assess whether there are any visibility restrictions in the vertical plane. It leads to a skewed perspective and inaccurate assumptions. In actual fact, once the topography is accurately taken into account, it's obvious that the crest of the road to the south of the access does not interfere with achieving the required visibility display, and there is room to spare. And Mr. Price confirmed, I think it may have been in an answer to one of your questions, Ma'am, that there's actually an additional 10 metres available beyond the required visibility display until the crest of the road has any impact. Excuse me for a moment. Mr. Carey's evidence did not challenge the accuracy of the vertical vis display plan. He conceded in cross-examination that Mr. Price had correctly calculated the required visibility displays, and that's set out in Appendix E of the TA. He also conceded that the required visibility displays for the proposed development could in fact be achieved. In light of that, there is no convincing evidence before the inquiry that there is any concern regarding the achievement of visibility displays and/or the safety of the proposed access. It should not be forgotten in my submission, Ma'am, that the zenith of Mr. Carey's case, as stated in his proof of evidence, is that given the safety concerns, it is believed the visibility should be measured on site. Notwithstanding the fact that Mr. Price had already undertaken a full assessment of the vertical vis display as part of the TA, he then went on to do just that. In fact, for some reason, he was then criticised for it by Mr. Carey. Mr. Price's check physical measure of visibility on the site as set out in his rebuttal simply confirms the position as set out in the TA. The unreasonable position of Mr. Carey in criticising Mr. Price for doing what he had said needed to be done simply reflects the overall tone of the council's evidence regarding allegations of highway safety. Had there been any proper engagement, Ma'am, in my submission from Amy or the council in response to the express invitation from Mr. Price, and I give you the reference there, prior to the start of the inquiry, it is likely that this issue would have been fully resolved. Indeed, given that the Highways Authority specifically considered this point and satisfied themselves that there was no safety issue, this should never have formed part of the council's case at all. Much was made and has been in closings today by my learned friend of the appellant's Stage 1 RSA. In effect, Mr. Carey asserted that the appellant's RSA confirmed the conclusions of the AMI RSA. This supposition was rightly resisted by Mr. Price, Ma'am, in evidence in chief and cross-examination. Mr. Price explained that the issue identified in the appellant's RSA took all of the key technical information into account and expressly proceeded on the basis that required visibility displays could be achieved. And Ma'am, just read the two documents, it's absolutely clear from the wording of them that the appellant's RSA did take into account and accepted the principle in the first principle that visibility displays could actually be properly achieved, and there was no issue regarding the vertical plane and the interference from the carriageway. Mr. Price went on to explain in detail that there is no requirement for extra visibility, that's the language used in the AMI RSA, and indeed national guidance in NFS 2 makes clear that being able to see too far ahead can increase the risk of collisions at priority junctions, especially for cyclists. Indeed, the visibility display calculations prescribed by MFS2 also apply an adjustment to the required displays depending on the road gradient. In effect, as Mr. Price explained, a shorter visibility display will be required if the road leading to an access is steep. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, uphill gradients mean that drivers brake faster, and secondly, steeper roads reduce forward visibility and therefore driver speeds. It's obvious in this case that the road gradient has this effect on drivers travelling north. The recorded speed is 32.10 miles per hour, notwithstanding the 60 mile an hour designation. And I give you the reference there, footnote 21. Furthermore, it is important not to misunderstand the role of any RSA. IQ5 sets out the requirements for road safety audit for highway schemes on trunk road and motorway network. It is, of course, also used to undertake RSAs for schemes which affect local roads. As made clear in the introduction of IQ5, the objective of the road safety audit is to identify aspects of engineering interventions that could give rise to safety problem and to such modifications that could improve road safety. It simply does not follow that where an RSA identifies a problem, that means that there is a road safety issue. Where an RSA identifies a problem and recommendation, the designer of the scheme in question, in this case that's Hexa Consulting, of course represented by Mr. Price, is expressly entitled to disagree with the problem, giving appropriate reasoning for doing so. Ultimately, any action which is needed will be discussed and determined in close liaison with the Highway Authority as part of discussions relating to Section 278 agreements. And that's the appropriate stage for these details to be addressed. There are some similarities in terms of the recommendations made in AMI RSA Problem 4 and the appellant's RSA Problem 1. They both reference the potential for 30 mile an hour speed limit to be moved so as to encompass the access for the proposed development. However, there's no getting away from the fact that the Problem 4 in the AMI RSA is predicated on visibility being severely restricted to the right. That is not the case, and I do have to expressly disagree with my learned friend on that particular point. I'll just find the reference to you, ma'am. So that's paragraph 4 of Mr. Hunter's submissions. The evidence demonstrates that that visibility is not severely restricted. It's the opposite. In addition, the AMI RSA goes as far as suggesting that the 30 mile per hour speed limit should be relocated to the golf club access. This is extreme and entirely unrelated to the proposed development. Mr. Price explained in evidence in chief that this could in fact increase the risk of collisions. A 30 mile an hour speed limit signage are used to signal entry into an urban area. If they are deployed too soon, drivers will be likely to disregard them, and that could potentially lead to increased overall speeds and increased risk of collision. Mr. Price, given his designer's response to both RSAs, opined in evidence in chief that based on all of the evidence as a whole, including actual measured speeds and the fact that required visibility displays can be achieved, there was no requirement to locate the 30 mile an hour speed limit. And that is obviously directly in point or in dispute between myself and my learned friend. Mr. Hunter's paragraph 7 on page 3 suggests that Mr. Price agreed the opposite. That's not accepted, ma'am. You'll have your own notes. Mr. Price, I think, said it could be beneficial. He didn't say that it was necessary. if the Highway Authority considered this necessary when dealing with the Section 278 agreement, it could of course be required to be provided. Mr. Price agreed in evidence in chief and cross-examination that there would be some benefit in including gateway features or other signage at the detailed design stage to provide a warning to drivers of an upcoming junction on the left. And that is what the appellant's RSA speaks to. It was about awareness of the junction for approaching drivers, not visibility per se, in terms of actual visibility displays being able to be achieved, but just awareness. Again, Mr. Price noted that this would usually be dealt with by way of Section 278 agreement with the Highway Authority, and Mr. Carey conceded that any of these measures could be appropriately secured by way of condition should you consider that necessary, ma'am. Problem 1 of the AMI RSA was roundly rejected by Mr. Price as giving rise to any justifiable safety concerns. The factual position regarding the footpath to the south of the site is clearly set out in CD 220. Once again, this is an issue which the Highway Authority expressly asked the appellant to consider in more detail during the determination process. Firstly, the destinations that will attract pedestrians from the proposed development are to the north. Secondly, the existing footway to the south terminates at a private driveway and offers no clear design line. Thirdly, as Mr. Carey himself confirmed, some pedestrians have been observed walking on the road to the south of the proposed development, and at footnote 26, just said in rural areas that's hardly uncommon or unusual. And yet, the personal injury data for the last 7 years demonstrates there haven't been any accidents occurring at all. This is not an inherently unsafe road or part of the highway. Mr. Carey provided no evidence that proposed development would result in any material increase in pedestrian movements to the south of the access, and the point for that reason takes the council nowhere and falls far short of the evidence that would be required to refuse the development on highway safety grounds. Problem 5, ma'am, of the AMI RSA relates to assertions that the location of existing street features in the adopted highway would result in visibility issues. The recommendation is that the signage and gully should be relocated. There can be no doubt that should it be deemed necessary by the Highway Authority, the relocation of such signage can be addressed via a Section 278 agreement. On any measure, this cannot seriously be considered to result in an unacceptable impact on highway safety. And ma'am, it's actually a good example of the sort of detail that can be picked up at the stage 2 RSA stage more usually, that although it's flagged as a problem, it doesn't mean that it's a safety issue in MPPF terms. The position is entirely supported by MFS2, which states that in general, occasional obstacles to visibility are not large enough to obscure a whole vehicle or pedestrian, including a child or wheelchair user, will not have a significant impact on road safety. The potential need for relocation of such signage is a matter to be addressed either at discharge of condition stage or via the 278 process. Problem 6 of the AMI RSA is similar nature to problem 5. The suggestion that sharp angles of new internal road layout could result in any material highway safety impacts borders on the ridiculous. It is obvious that any such issue can be dealt with through detailed design via the discharge of conditions or Section 278 process, and this was ultimately conceded by Mr. Carey in cross-examination. And finally, ma'am, and this is where I just ask you to take care with Mr. Hunter's submission, again at paragraph 7, about the point about the carriageway having to be extended. There is no credible evidence to suggest that the carriageway to the south of the access would need to be widened to address any road safety issue. In fact, the AMI RSA does not even go that far. The totality of the council's case on this issue is a throwaway comment in Mr. Carey's rebuttal proof, which is entirely unsupported by any objective assessment. And questions posed to Mr. Price on that issue in cross-examination were adventurous to say the least and entirely unsuccessful. Moving on to accessibility then, ma'am. The evidence of Mr. Carey and accessibility issues was in direct contradiction to matters which were agreed by the Council and the SOCG, and I give you the examples there. There was no dispute between Mr. Carey and Mr. Price on the accuracy of the distances set out in Table 5.6 of Mr. Price's proof of evidence. The differences between the experts was one of judgment as to whether or not they represented an acceptable level of accessibility, notwithstanding that is often the case in these sorts of cases. They refer to and relied upon the same guidance documents in reaching their views. It is, of course, a matter of fact that houses which are located towards the west of the proposed development are further away from Wyeston Road than those in the east. That does not render those houses inaccessible or materially disadvantaged in accessibility terms. The increases in distance need to be seen in context. The question is not, are they further, but whether the degree of additional distance results in any material harm. The proposed development is inherently sustainable in locational terms by means of its immediate adjacency to the existing urban edge of Ashbourne, which is designated as a Tier 1 settlement in the local plan. In relatively rural areas, the accessibility of the proposed development needs to be seen in context. Mr. Carey fairly conceded that in considering accessibility, it's necessary to take a pragmatic approach and have regard to the nature of Ashbourne and the wider district. In order to better understand that context, regard can be had to the extant local plan allocations for Ashbourne, in particular sites HC2, A, D and E. And of course, Mr. Carey declined to comment on that point when it was put to him. Mrs. Ford, the ball was passed to her, but then she also declined to comment. Put simply in my submission, ma'am, if you take a look at them, and I give you the core document number so that you have that before you, it's obvious that they fare less well than the proposed development in terms of their relationship to key services located in the town centre. There is no need, of course, for the proposed development to be the best located site in accessibility terms, but this wider context is important to bear in mind. Mr. Carey accepted in cross-examination that paragraph 114A of the MPPF, which requires appropriate opportunities to promote sustainable transport modes, can be taken up, that it's qualified by reference to the type of the development and its location. In simple terms, there is no requirement in either national or local policy for every scheme to be equally accessible. Mr. Carey accepted that given that accessibility is inherently a highways matter, that permission should not be refused on the basis that the accessibility of a particular scheme is not perfect. And ma'am, the proportionality that's baked into paragraph 114A of the framework also features heavily in the development plan policies HC19 and TRA. They are not prescriptive. In effect, they recognise that what a developer needs to do is do their best. Much time was expended, ma'am, discussing the formally proposed footpath from the proposed development to Premier Avenue. If this footpath could have been delivered by the appellant accepts it would have resulted in marginal gains for accessibility. And that was Mr. Bassett's point about, I think he quantified it as limited weight, but some harm. I think those were the words that he used in his proof. However, the absence of the footpath plainly does not render the proposed development unacceptable. The ability of the proposed development to facilitate a choice of travel for future residents is aptly demonstrated by the objectives of the proposed travel plan, and I give you the reference, ma'am, and which, as Mr. Price opined, will seek to achieve a 12% reduction in single occupancy car trips, converting these to more sustainable modes of travel, including public transport, walking and cycling. Mr. Carey conceded in cross-examination that travel plans can achieve material modal shift, and whether this would materialise depended on their administration and effective implementation. In my submission, ma'am, there can be no doubt in this case that the proposed travel plan will be administered and effectively implemented by the appointed travel plan coordinator, with baseline surveys to be carried out post-occupation as part of determining final targets for modal shift, and monitoring to be undertaken for at least 4 years after the baseline surveys are undertaken. Ma'am, I then comment about the gradients of the main street, which runs through the proposed development and will not create an impediment to any users. It is gently sloping. That was accepted by Mr. Carey. And just on that point, Ma'am, I think my learned friend's submissions say, again, I think it might be, I'm just trying to find the right paragraph. Sorry, just bear with me one moment. Accessibility. So it's paragraph 21 of Mr. Hunter's submissions over on page 7, the second bullet point. It's not accepted that the appellant's witnesses didn't dispute that the gradients on the site meant only the fittest people living on the site could be expected to walk through it. Obviously, Ma'am, you'll have your own notes of the evidence. As I said, Mr. Carey specifically accepted that it is gently sloping. It runs from east to west and is DDA compliant. Even on Mr. Carey's evidence in response to your questions, Ma'am, all residents of the proposed development will be able to access the nearby primary school, for example, within a maximum 12 to 15 minute walk. The same can be said for the bus service. So it's not correct that it's only the primary school. It's the same for the bus service, and that can be accessed via Wyreston Road. I give you the footnote there so that you can see where that's set out in the evidence, with onward connections to major employment destinations. Mr. Price drew attention to the Bunn and Walkinshaw report, Ma'am, which seeks to pull together advice from a range of guidance notes on accessibility and undertakes an empirical assessment of how far people will in fact walk in practice. It recommends that the use of 1,950 metres as a travel distance for walking. When compared to the distances in table 5.6 of Mr. Price's proof, it's obvious that the proposed development will perform well against this metric from all parts of the site. Ma'am, finally on this point, the accessibility of the proposed development was interrogated by the Highways Authority, with whom extensive negotiations were undertaken to review the layout of the proposed development. The Highway Authority ultimately maintained no objection to the proposed development on accessibility grounds. As the relevant statutory consultee, the position of the Highways Authority should be afforded significant weight. Moving then to highway capacity. As already noted above, the council withdrew part of reason for refusal 1 during the course of the inquiry. It's no longer alleged that proposed development will result in a severe impact on the transport network. However, differences remain in the position of Mr. Carey and Mr. Price with respect to any impact which the traffic generated by the proposed development will have on Derby Road, A515, Old Hill Signal Junction. I think there's also, this is the way that Mr. Price describes it in his rebuttal evidence, but it also includes Sturson Road, which is the one we heard a lot about. I'm just calling it the junction for the purposes of the submissions. Mr. Price's rebuttal sets out his careful assessment of the capacity of the junction. I give you the reference there, concluding that the trips would have a negligible impact on performance of capacity of the junction. His table 2.6 demonstrates that in the 2032 future scenario, the proposed development results in an increase of 2 cars on one arm of the junction. That's the Sturston Road junction. He fairly quantified this as an imperceptible change. Mr. Carey conceded in cross-examination that an increase of this magnitude was potentially an imperceptible change compared to the future year scenario without the development. That should say, in contrast, I think, Ma'am, sorry, is a typo in the next paragraph. In contrast, Mr. Carey averred that the proposed development would result in a moderate adverse impact on the junction. That's notwithstanding the fact that Mr. Carey did not challenge any of the variables or parameters used by Mr. Price, all of which were set out in Appendix C of his rebuttal proof. Unsurprisingly, in this context, Mr. Carey's assertion of moderate impact did not withstand scrutiny under cross-examination. He accepted that Mr. Price had adopted a robust approach to his assessment and that he had assessed the worst case. That included using in the table 2.6 of his rebuttal, using the mean maximum Q. Secondly, using the 2032 future year in the context of a scheme which is likely to be built and occupied well within 5 years from the grant of permission, which of course won't take us to 2032. And thirdly, not making any allowance for modal shift from the trips to be generated by the proposed development. Even allowing for this highly conservative and robust assessment, Mr. Carey accepted that none of the arms of the junction exceeded the maximum acceptable degree of saturation. Mr. Price, in cross-examination, remained confident in his assessment that any increases in traffic at this junction, which could be attributed to the proposed development, would result in no more than a negligible impact. And at the close of the evidence, his position stands unchallenged effectively by any cogent or objective evidence. Moving then to design, ma'am. Firstly, this is a case where the appellant worked closely with the council's officers and other relevant statutory consultees, including the Highway Authority and the Wildlife Trust, through an iterative design process in order to produce a residential scheme of high quality design. And in that context, to be faced with a design-related reason for refusal is particularly disappointing for the appellants, and this undermines the objectives which underpin paragraphs 38 to 42 of the framework. On behalf of the council, Mr. Lally took, in my submission, ma'am, an entirely partisan and blinkered approach to what good design encompasses, which did not withstand being tested under cross-examination. On any measure, the proposed development provides a substantial amount of green infrastructure of over 50% of the site. Mr. Jackson gives you the precise figure, I think it's 57, with significant gains for ecology in both qualitative and quantitative terms. Despite conceding in cross that delivery of green infrastructure and ecology benefits are a key aspect of demonstrating good design, Mr. Lally failed entirely to take this into account in his overall assessment of the proposed development. This is a major lacuna in Mr. Larry's approach, which fundamentally undermines the credibility of his conclusion that the proposed development constitutes poor design. The first point from Mr. Lally related to landscape setting. In my submission, ma'am, his attempt to contend that the development fails to respond to its landscape setting was, as Mr. Jackson opined in evidence in chief and cross-examination, it was doomed to failure. His assertion that the site occupies a strategically important location was not supported by any cogent evidence base and directly contradicts the LVA for the proposed development. Because that was his starting point, ma'am, and this is, sorry, just extemporaneous comment, because that was his starting point and his starting point was wrong, it follows that where he ended up would also be incorrect. But back to the main text. Reference by Mr. Lally to high-level comments in the Sheila and the landscape sensitivity study were entirely insufficient to base any such conclusion upon, as Mrs. Ford accepts in cross-examination and Mr. Jackson cogently explained in evidence in chief, care must be taken when seeking to rely on any commentary provided in the Sheila. The landscape sensitivity study is similarly no substitute for a site level assessment, such as that undertaken by the appellant, and given its strategic nature, rendering it unsuitable for reaching conclusions as to the role and function of the site within its wider countryside setting. In the absence of an actual landscape character and visual assessment conducted in accordance with the appropriate guidance in GLVIA 3 by an experienced and suitably qualified landscape professional, Mr. Lally's position was fundamentally undermined. As Mr. Jackson authoritatively explained, in order to make a case that the scheme fails to respond to its landscape setting, one must first properly assess and understand the setting itself. This Mr. Lally entirely failed to do. Mr. Lally's rebuttal went further, claiming that the site acts as a landscape buffer and that in order to be well designed, the layout should maintain this. This assertion cannot, in my submission, ma'am, be sensibly understood as anything other than an allegation that the proposed development will have an adverse effect on its current role in the wider landscape. Mr. Lally's evidence on this point was again not underpinned by any landscape or visual assessment, which assessed the role of the site in the wider landscape. It was comprehensively debunked and dismissed by Mr. Jackson. Even taking Mr. Lally's additional views from Wyerstone Road into account, Mr. Jackson authoritatively, sorry, I'll put my teeth back in a minute, authoritatively advised the inquiry that the site itself simply does not perform any role as a landscape buffer between the wider countryside and the existing development in Ashbourne, as perceived and experienced from Wyston Road. Whether a piece of land performs an important role as a landscape buffer to the wider countryside is an intrinsic part of assessing landscape character and visual impacts. The protestations of Mr. Lally that this is only a matter of considering landscape setting in the context of urban design principles was entirely misconceived. Finally, on this particular aspect of Mr. Lally's evidence, it should be recorded that he conceded that the proposed development would deliver a significant improvement to the current edge of development as experienced between the A52 and the Red Rose scheme. So this is the immediate approach after the A52, past the site access and what you can currently see there with the Red Rose scheme. So that's, I give you the footnotes as to where the existing view can be understood. It's actually the Amy RSA photograph. He likewise accepted the evidence of Mr. Jackson. At paragraph 33.12 of his rebuttal note that the proposed development will, at year 15, result in a beneficial visual effect from viewpoint C. That's the gate that Mr. Lally identified due to the screening effect of the extensive landscape planting, which the proposed development will deliver, softening and screening the existing hard edge presented by the Red Rose scheme as you see it from across the valley from that vantage point. Indeed, Mr. Jackson's evidence wasn't challenged at all. Appearance and materials. The allegation of Mr. Lally that the proposed development fails to respond to the relevant landscape character assessment because of the colour of the proposed external materials was an unnecessary diversion. Firstly, Mr. Lally did not claim any conflict with policy PD5 of the local plan. Accordingly, there is simply no basis for the assertion that the proposed materials are unsympathetic or fail to complement the landscape character within which the site sits. Secondly, the proposed material comprising two types of red brick and grey roof tiles were expressly agreed with the council's officers. I give you the footnote there to the relevant correspondence between the appellant and the council's officers during the determination of the application, and they do reflect the warm red brick and colour of the Staffordshire blue clay tiles in any event, which Mr. Carr explained actually read as grey. Thirdly, the use of red brick and grey roof tiles is a clear design feature of adjacent existing development. Fourthly, if there was any concern about the materials to be used, this will be dealt with by condition, and that point was conceded by Mr. Lally. Connectivity. Mr. Lally's assertion that the design of the proposed development is somehow fundamentally undermined by the absence of a footpath connection to Premier Avenue was entirely unconvincing, and in terms of its overall importance, the determination of the appeal flatly contradicted by Mrs. Ford, who accepted fairly that the absence of the footpath connectivity to the adjacent development would not be a sufficient basis on which to refuse permission. Mr. Lally's approach also ignores an important aspect of connectivity and integration, which plainly has a visual component. Mr. Carr highlighted in response to one of your questions, Ma'am, that the public open space being delivered by the proposed development will integrate visually with the public open space in the Red Road development and will not read as awkward or visually segregated. Mr. Lally's criticism of the layout of the proposed development ignores the fact that cul-de-sacs are a prominent feature of the adjacent existing development. There is nothing intrinsically bad about this in design terms. Ignoring the prevalence of cul-de-sacs in the surrounding settlement pattern, oh, there's a typo there, ma'am, sorry, there's an R missing out of pattern there, would result in a layout which failed to fit well into its surrounding context from an urban design perspective, I should say. Mr. Lally's position also fails to understand that Part 2 of the National Model Design Code comprises a series of guidance notes, some of which pull in different directions. It is not prescriptive in its terms, and there is no proper basis for the contention that paragraph 139 of the NPPF means that development should be refused if all aspects of the National Model Design Code are not wholly reflected in a particular scheme design. Indeed, this latter point was quickly conceded by Mrs. Ford in cross-examination. As Mr. Carr opined in evidence in chief, a holistic approach should be taken to assessing whether or not the proposed development would be well designed. Boundary treatments, ma'am. The concerns raised by Mr. Lally about proposed boundary treatments were equally unsuccessful, as became evident in cross-examination. Mr. Lally's case on this point was predicated on the assumption that timber fences would read as hard edges to development, particularly where they relate directly to open countryside. That's a direct quote from Mr. Lally's evidence. As demonstrated by Mr. Jackson's photo montage of viewpoint C, there will be no such hard edges to the open countryside as a result of the boundary treatments in the design of the proposed development. They will be effectively screened by new and substantial landscape planting and existing topography in the western part of the site and or the existing buffer between the site and the A52, which will be unaffected by the proposed development. Of course, to the extent that the council considered a different design of boundary treatments was required, this will be open to them to secure via discharge of conditions. Open spaces, ma'am. Mr. Carr's appendix UDO4 contains updated 3D visuals, view A through to C, which demonstrate that the proposed open space within the scheme will be addressed by houses fronting onto these areas, creating an integrated physical relationship and passive surveillance. The accuracy of Mr. Carr's evidence in this respect was not challenged by Mr. Lally. However, Mr. Lally maintained that the proposed development would result in green open spaces, constituting spaces left over after planning, turning their backs on these spaces. Again, that's a direct quote from Mr. Lally's evidence. However, as Mr. Carr eloquently illustrated in evidence in chief, I say illustrated because he did it by reference to a plan in part, ma'am, so rather than just spoken, this is a result of Mr. Lally misunderstanding the role and function of the spaces in question, which are sited on the northern and southern boundaries of the proposed development. As Mr. Carr explained, these are not public open space. They are designed and proposed for use as ecological habitat. The topography of the areas in question, both of which are steep, will dissuade access for recreation, and the specific design of the proposed habitat can be varied via discharge of condition to mixed scrubland, and that's without any impact on the percentage of net gain to be achieved, to further reduce access if considered desirable. The area of ecological habitat which appears to back onto the Red Row scheme on plan actually has no visual interface with it because of the topography. There will be no open views of timber fences from the Red Row open space in this location. Furthermore, the area of ecological habitat to the rear of the split level units on the southern boundary is provided with natural surveillance from the first floor outdoor seating areas of those house types. Dealing next with creating character, ma'am, Mr. Carr undertook a careful review of the proposed house types that will be used in the proposed development, having regard to the assertion of Mr. Lally that the proposed house types would result in identikit or anywhere type scheme. This process exposed once again the narrow focus which underpins the entirety of Mr. Lally's evidence in this case, who failed to recognise that the appellant has proposed the use of bespoke house types as part of the proposed development. That just wasn't dealt with at all by Mr. Lally. It's something that he completely missed, just didn't take it into account. Mr. Carr drew attention to the careful detailing of the 21 house types being proposed within the scheme, which provides consistency throughout the proposed development whilst avoiding bland homogeneity. Mr. Carr further opined that the sense of place which will be created by the scheme can only be properly understood in 3D once it's understood that the positioning of the houses themselves creates variation and rhythm in the street scene, while stepping down to reflect the natural topography of the site. Mr. Carr's considered and careful analysis led him to robustly conclude that proposed development will create a strong sense of character and a distinctive sense of place, reflecting the characteristics in this part of Ashbourne. Mr. Carr made clear his view that the experience of the street will play a positive role in the design of the proposed development, providing visual interest through its gentle sloping gradient and ensuring legibility of distinct spaces throughout the scheme, as per Mr. Carr's Appendix UDO 4. The proposition that the street should be lined on both sides with equal spacing in order to comply with paragraph 136 of the framework was rejected by Mr. Carr. He opined that such an approach would be out of character with the intentional design approach of achieving an informal layout to the main street. And Ma'am, I hope you've noticed that I didn't reference the Champs-Elysees. I wanted to put it in a footnote, but I decided against it. Mr. Lally's assertion that all streets are to be tree lined is clearly not borne out by the wording of paragraph 136 of the framework. The most up-to-date adoptable areas plan also demonstrates that the street trees being proposed will not be in private ownership, but instead will be managed by the management company. And again, that's just a question of Mr. Lally not effectively reading the plans that were there available before him. Quad blocks. The appellant has been careful in my submission, Ma'am, to ensure that the proposed design of affordable housing results in tenure blindness, which is, of course, what we are trying to achieve. As Mr. Carr rightly opined, this is predominantly achieved by external appearance. I direct you, Ma'am, to view 9, 10 and 11 of the 3D visuals pack. That was the up-to-date one from September 2023. I'll give you the CD reference there. They illustrate the external appearance of the quad blocks in the context of the wider development. It's difficult to understand with those in front of you in my submission, Ma'am, any logical or empirical basis for the assertion that they will be identifiable as affordable houses due to their design, or that they are intended in any way to be pared back in design terms compared to the rest of the scheme. It's simply incorrect to state, as Mr. Lally does, that affordable housing is confined to the far end of the development. And the plan, I give you there the reference, the CD 2.23, is actually the layout, Ma'am. So that's a reference to the plan. That demonstrates that affordable housing is proposed in a variety of locations throughout the proposed development. Market houses are also proposed at the western end of the layout, as Mr. Carr explained, and the location of the quad blocks are adjacent to the green heart of the proposed development, which is an optimum location within the scheme, providing a verdant and open setting for residents to enjoy and experience. Mr. Lally's assertions regarding internal space is once again at direct odds with paragraphs 530, 531 and 533 of the Statement of Common Ground. Mr. Carr robustly rejected the suggestion that there was anything intrinsically wrong with properties facing north. The mere northern orientation of proposed dwelling cannot automatically be assumed to result in any adverse impact on the quality of internal space. Mr. Lally provided no objective evidence to support his suppositions that sunlight, daylight and ventilation of the quadlocks would undermine the quality of life. The willingness of Mr. Lally to make such bold assertions in the absence of any actual evidence further undermines, in my submission, the credibility of his evidence overall. Moving then to planning policy and planning balance, Ma'am. Overall, there's a high degree of agreement and commonality in the approach between Mr. Bassett and Mrs. Ford. Of course, the position of Mrs. Ford is unavoidably weakened by the Council's acceptance that key parts of its case can no longer be sustained. There's the reference I give there are to the reasons for refusal that have been withdrawn during the inquiry. And of course, Mrs. Ford's evidence was predicated on those being maintained. Both Mr. Bassett and Mrs. Ford agree that the starting point is the presumption in favour of the development plan, and the question of compliance with the development plan must be assessed against the policies as a whole. It is only where there is conflict with the policies of the development plan taken as a whole that the tilted balance test of the MPPF comes into play, by reason of the council being unable to demonstrate a 5-year supply of housing. However, as we've already heard in opening and throughout the inquiry, Ma'am, the need for the appellant to rely on tilted balance test is substantially reduced in this case. The policies of the local plan expressly support the principle of proposed development on this site in circumstances where the council is unable to demonstrate a 5-year supply of housing. Mrs. Ford agreed that the key policies of the local plan support the principle of residential development at the site. The determinative factor, of course, for the professional opinions of Mr. Bassett and Mrs. Ford is the extent of the dispute between their respective colleagues on technical matters. The absence of cogent and compelling evidence from Mr. Carey and Mr. Lally fundamentally undermines the position of Mrs. Ford. Having tested the council's case through the examination of the evidence, the appellant respectively invites you, ma'am, to prefer the thorough and compelling evidence of Mr. Price, Mr. Carr and Mr. Jackson, whose position remained in all material respects unassailable under cross-examination. Mr. Bassett remained firm in his view that the evidence of Mr. Price, Mr. Carr and Mr. Jackson demonstrate that there will be no conflict with the development plan as a whole, and there are no material considerations which suggest permission should be refused. And moving on to scheme benefits, there's no difference between Mr. Bassett and Mrs. Ford and the significant weight they attribute to the delivery of market and affordable housing by this scheme. Nothing turns on the difference in the parties' positions regarding the extent of the shortfall. They both agree significant weight should be given either way. Mrs. Ford fairly accepted that there is no other mechanism available to the council to address its 5-year supply shortfall in the short to medium term. Further, she conceded, given the paucity of delivery from allocations, that the shortfall in housing land supply is acute and likely to become chronic. Mr. Bassett advised the inquiry that he had not previously seen such a low contribution from the allocations in a local plan. That's in a 5-year supply assessment, ma'am, of course. This was, in his considered opinion, clear evidence that the plan itself was failing and the position was likely to worsen rather than improve until a new local plan has been adopted in several years' time. Both Mrs. Ford and Mr. Bassett accepted that the grant of planning permission for schemes such as the proposed development represented the only realistic option available to the council to address its shortfall. Mr. Bassett further emphasised the substantial shortfall in affordable housing delivery, drawing attention to the evidence of Mr. Roberts, and I give you the full references in the footnotes, ma'am. That evidence demonstrates a failure to deliver against the local plan need figure of 96 houses per annum. It's affordable need, not to be conflated with the objectively assessed need, of course. The direction of travel is only expected to worsen, given the significant drop-off in delivery in recent years and the most up-to-date evidence on affordable need, which increases the annual figure up to 226. Mrs. Ford fairly accepted that the need for affordable homes is both chronic and acute, and attributed significant weight to the contribution that this development can deliver. Mr. Bassett and Mrs. Ford diverged in their approach to characterising the degree of benefit from ecology improvements. Mrs. Ford ascribed moderate weight, while Mr. Bassett attributed significant weight. I set out the references from Mr. Hoy's evidence there, ma'am. I give you this precise references and I don't need to take you through them line by line. In conclusion, Mr. Hoy's evidence fully supports the conclusion of Mr. Bassett that this is a case where significant weight should be afforded to the ecology benefits of the scheme, which significantly exceed the requirements of the local plan policy PD3. It was entirely proper, ma'am, in my submission for Mr. Bassett to accept, in the event that you find that there will be an unacceptable impact on highway safety, that it is likely that the permission will be refused. It's nothing to the point that paragraph 115 of the framework is not expressly referenced in footnote 7 as a case where the tilted balance will be disapplied. It is axiomatic that if there is an unacceptable impact on highway safety is posed by a development, then the risk to life weighs heavily, potentially and conclusively, against the grant of planning permission. In my submission, no sensible parallel can be drawn between this eventuality and one where you find, ma'am, that the proposed development is not well designed. That is fundamentally different in nature and kind to a finding of unacceptable highway safety. In any event, after carefully considering the evidence before the inquiry, Mr. Bassett's judgment remained unchanged. In the event that it's necessary to consider the tilted balance, there are quite simply no adverse impacts which would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of the proposed development. And in conclusion, ma'am, having regard to all of the above, the appellant respectfully invites you to grant the appeal in accordance with the development plan and thereby grant permission for the proposed development subject to the draft section 106 and conditions. And unless I can help with anything further, ma'am, that concludes the appellant's case.
Thank you, Ms. Ogley. Okay. I think that concludes everything that we need to do in person then in this inquiry, or virtually. We've got our dates for the costs applications. So really just thank you for your time today and the cases that you've put to me, and that is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Could I just ask one quick question before you? Are you the timetable previously set out for you issuing your decision? Is that are we still sort of sticking to the same kind of dates? So my clients will always ask me for an indication.
And we never give an indication really.
Yeah.
Just because although I've got an idea in my mind, things can happen and we juggle other cases. But I don't envisage any delays at this point, but obviously that could change.
That's very helpful and very fair. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you both. Nice to meet you both in the inquiry.
Likewise.
And maybe see you again.
Thank you, ma'am. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.